Good evening everyone, welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers update tonight, a little later than normal on the 13th of January 2014. My name's Chris Nitzo, and just a quick heads up that tomorrow night's update will be just as late as tonight's due to some training commitments that I have. Alright, let's get into it. We need to talk about two tropical lows. The first one in the Northern Territory, subject now to a tropical cyclone advice, and the second one in the northeastern Coral Sea, which also has potential to further deepen. Looking at the latest real-time tropical cyclone potential genesis regions, we can see that the first region is really bullseyeing in and around the Tiwi Islands. We are starting to see some reasonable potential there of a tropical cyclone forming. The other area we're starting to see a potential for tropical cyclone formation is around the southern Solomon Islands and in the far northeastern Coral Sea. If we look at vertical wind shear over the region, vertical wind shear is currently one of the major limiting factors of the tropical cyclone formation in the Northern Territory low. We can see that in this region we have a fair amount of wind shear in there right around where the low is located, and that's going to be a huge factor in limiting potential development until the system can get into lower shear conditions. Also over the northeastern Coral Sea there's no such issues. So what we have here is we just don't have a low pressure system yet. It's sort of just a big broad monsoon trough. We will get a low pressure system developing there, and if we do, in those sort of shear conditions, it should intensify pretty rapidly given those current atmospheric conditions out there. They're much more favourable out here in the northeast Coral Sea than they are in the Northern Territory, but the issue we have in the Northern Territory is that the system has already formed, whereas in the northeast Coral Sea, it's in the process of just starting to form now. It looks pretty impressive to the naked eye on satellite up around the Darwin region, just to the north of Darwin. We see a very impressive satellite signature, but when we actually take a bit of a closer look, we can see that a lot of the convection is being displaced, a lot of it being displaced out here to the west of the low-level circulation centre. So we have the strong storms developing right around where the low is, which is around that circle, but we see a lot of that convection being displaced out as soon as it tries to form deep convection over the centre. It is whisked away to the west through vertical wind shear. Now, I did tell you a couple of nights ago that we were going to see a massive increase in the activity here over the Solomon Islands, and look at this, just an amazing amount of cloud and rain activity now over the Solomons. This whole big chunk of stuff that is out here in the northeast, so this all this convection will actually start to form into something a little bit more significant. So this is the area we're watching out in here. Now, out of that big jumbly mess in there, we will see a tropical low form. Once it does form, it is, as I say, going to encounter some very favourable upper level conditions over the next, at least the next 48 to 72 hours. The latest update we have available at 5:30 PM Queensland time, 5 PM Northern Territory time. We have the tropical low up here. It is subject to a tropical cyclone advice or a tropical cyclone watch. It is expected to push in a southerly direction right over the top of the Tiwi Islands and then hug the coast. Now, if it can get itself offshore, it is very likely to form into a TC. If it stays onshore, if it stays really coastal, it probably won't quite make it to that intensity. So that's the dilemma, and you can see this grey area here. We have a grey region pushing way out to the west. We also have a grey region out to the east. Look, if it can push out here to the eastern extent of the error margin, we should see the system form into a TC. But obviously the issue is that if it remains over land or in close proximity to land, it's going to find it pretty difficult to get itself together enough to create gales around more than halfway around the centre of the system. So at this stage, a monsoon low when it passes Darwin, but if it can get itself offshore, if it can remain offshore, it could actually form into a TC. If you're after some really heavy flooding rains, you really want this thing to be pushing onshore and sticking around the coast, being a very broad monsoon low, because the idea behind the broad monsoon low is it's going to basically, there's going to be a lot of rain in a much larger area. If it tightens itself up into a TC, it's going to be a huge amount of rain over a very small area. So it's going to really limit the potential reach of that rainfall. However, in saying that, it isn't going to be the best looking tropical cyclone you've ever seen, even if it does make tropical cyclone status. Let's have a look at what all the different models are saying for this system. Because the system is reasonably weak, a lot of the model members are not picking up the actual tropical low just yet because it isn't very well structured. As I've mentioned, it's a fairly broad looking thing, and the convection continues to get sheared away. So models are having a little bit of trouble initializing the system currently. Hopefully that won't be as much of an issue as it pushes further to the south. But you can see here there's two schools of thought in the model guidance. We've got a push more towards the south, and then basically over land, over the territory, and then finally pushing into the Kimberley region. And then the second school of thought are these two model members here, which push it just offshore. And this is really the track that the Bureau is expecting, just offshore the tropical low. But you can see in the Bureau's error margin, it basically covers all the potential tracks there from the UK Met model. The CMC isn't a very accurate model when we look at tropical cyclones and their potential movement and formation, but just to show you, it is predicting a southerly track of the system straight into land, and then pushing in a southwesterly, possibly westerly movement towards the end of the forecast period. But once again, take this on with a grain of salt. It's not a very accurate global model. If we take a look at some of the higher resolution modelling from the global models from the GFS and then the Euro, if we look at the GFS tomorrow morning at 4 a.m, 7 a.m, the system remains in here between the Coburg and the Tiwis. At 10 a.m, it continues to remain really slow moving, but it does have a lot of wind to its north. You can see here even getting up to 40-45 knots of monsoonal gales to its north. Unfortunately, at that point in time, the system, or fortunately, hang on, depending on which way you're looking at it, we're looking at it from a tropical cyclone enthusiast perspective. Obviously, the public wouldn't be looking at it from that perspective. So, fortunately for you guys, it's going to make landfall, or it's expected to be right along the coast by the time those gales really start to ramp up. Now, this is by about 4 p.m. tomorrow. It's expected to make landfall a fair way to the east of Darwin, according to the GFS model guidance. And as we head to later on, it does start to get a move on Tuesday night, and we can really see it starting to accelerate. Here's Darwin. Now, if you're in Darwin, you're not going to see really the most effects of this until it's well south of you. You can start to see here around Darwin, we're getting 25 to 30 knot winds, but they don't start until Wednesday or very late Tuesday, once the system is well to the south, because that's when the monsoonal gales start to come in. Once the system is south of you, you get those onshore gales that are hitting the Darwin region, and so you're not going to see too much in terms of wind while it's to the north of you, but once it's south of you, you're going to see a lot of wind, possibly a lot of rain. Now, as we head towards further on in the forecast period, we head towards Wednesday afternoon and then through to Wednesday night, we can see the system continues on a southwest track, and by around about Thursday is then located over the Northern Territory WA border. Now, we won't track this further on the GFS, but we will on the Euro and see where does it go after that, because people in the Kimberley and Pilbara will be very interested in this. So 10 p.m. tonight, once again, the European model has the system in a very similar spot. As we head towards early tomorrow morning, we see the system really hasn't moved too far. It's sort of stuck on the edge of the Coburg Peninsula here, and it really doesn't have any steering mechanisms to make it move anywhere until later on Tuesday, when we get this big surge of northwesterlies and northerlies in the monsoon trough that will make it push in a southerly direction, and then it will start to accelerate very quickly to the south. But by Tuesday 1 p.m, look at this, around Darwin, you really have almost zero wind in this area, so you might be mistaken for thinking there is no low, but as I say, according to the GFS and the Euro, it's not till after the system tracks to the south of Darwin that we start to get these onshore winds that things get a little, not too nasty, but to the point where we're seeing 20 to 25 knot winds, and probably more than likely the heaviest rain once the system tracks to the south. You can see here Tuesday night we've got some fairly heavy rain right along the top end coastline, and then heading into Wednesday morning we continue to see that rainfall occurring, but pushing offshore with the bulk of the circulation now being offshore. So we see most of the rainfall also leaving and getting offshore as well. So you can see here's the circulation now, and we're starting to get gales on the northern side. Those gales not affecting Darwin, but getting pretty close. So you can see that really the bulk of the activity is happening once the system moves further to the south rather than north of Darwin. You can see here gales to its north, not too much to the south though, and that's going to limit its potential to form into a TC. Remember, if it can get offshore just a little bit more than the model is predicting, then we might see a TC out of it. What I want to do now is zoom out though and show you the longer term. We're going to breeze through the time frame here. We're going to go through to Wednesday night and then Thursday morning, and I want you to track this low with me. You can see the low here in the East Kimberley now, and as we head towards Thursday night, track it, and you can see it continues to move in a south-southwest direction. As we head towards Friday, we see the system starting to push in a more westerly direction now, a west-southwest direction, as we head to Friday night. Now, the reason it's starting to push into a more westerly direction is we have a new ridge building over the central parts of Australia, and that ridge is going to change the steering mechanism, and the steering mechanism will want to push it out here in a west-southwest to southwest direction, which means it's going to start pushing closer to the Kimberley or Pilbara coastline, again, even after being inland for so long. As we head towards Saturday morning, we see that the system continues to track, and it's got a very, very nice strong winds on the south side. It's got a good monsoon fetch to the north, so it is actually still a reasonable looking low pressure system, even though it's been over land for so long. And then as we head towards Saturday night, we see the system continuing to track much closer to the coast here between Broome and Port Hedland, and this is very interesting here, because if it can get itself offshore, it's going to have some pretty good conditions to further form into a TC. So it's just a matter of touch and go as to whether it can get offshore, and you can see here by Sunday morning the European model believes it can get offshore. And if we then have a look at things like wind shear at the time, once it gets offshore, you see that right along the Pilbara coastline there is very, very low wind shear values, and as long as it remains close to the coast in the Pilbara, there is a fair chance there that it will re-intensify into a tropical cyclone, or if it hasn't formed into a TC initially in the Northern Territory region, there is a fair chance that it will intensify into a TC once it's near the Pilbara. So it's very interesting that this thing won't just go inland and die. And this, now we're looking at the relative humidity values, remembering that cyclones require these blue shadings when it comes to relative humidity, which is a high amount of humidity in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, and it's got perfect conditions really for reformation if it can get offshore. Now I need to stress that, because people will go, you said it's going to reform. No, if it can get offshore, it certainly can reform. It certainly will have good conditions to do so. But you can see here that the European keeps it right on the coast. You can see here the center of the system remains right on the coast, and it really, really wants to become a TC. It just can't get itself over water. Now remember, if this model is off by just 50 kilometers, that's all it needs. Another 50 kilometers, we will have a fully blown TC off the Pilbara coastline. So just be aware that it's a very touch and go situation. Because the Coral Sea system is unlikely to affect the coast directly, at least in the foreseeable future, we won't talk about that too much tonight. We've let the Northern Territory system hog our airtime, but let's have a look quickly at what it does. This is Tuesday night. We see the system really just meandering about the southern Solomon Islands. As we head towards Wednesday morning, we see the system just starting to show a little bit of a chance at getting a move on. Now, where it tracks, it's expected to track more in a south to southwesterly direction, more than likely more in a southerly direction, but you can see here on Wednesday afternoon it does want to show a little bit of southwesterly movement. There are gales, but those gales are a long way away from the center of the system, so it's unlikely to be called by the Bureau unless those gales start to develop closer to the system. But we do see certainly the potential for gales, especially to the south of the system, in that high to low pressure gradient pressure gradient force. So we can see here as we move the system on to Thursday and then into Friday morning, the system continues to track in a south to southwest direction through into the northern central Coral Sea, and we can see once again these gales are a long way removed from the center of the system. So once again, it's very doubtful that the Bureau will call this a TC unless those gales show that they can wrap around the center of the actual low. So at this stage it looks quite monsoonal, it looks quite broad, it doesn't look like a very tight circulation in the Coral Sea. So as we head towards Saturday, we continue to see the system starting to probably accelerate a little to the south. If we have a look at what the steering mechanisms are expected to be, and we look at the very much the upper levels, we see that there's an upper level trough here over Queensland that's resulting in westerly winds in the upper levels, and there's an upper level high over Fiji and Vanuatu, which is resulting in northerly winds in the upper levels. So the vector direction of the system should be in that particular direction. If it becomes a fairly strong TC or a fairly deep low pressure system, we would likely see a track towards the south or south-southeast by the weekend. Now, bearing in mind that, once again, we talked last night about the orientation of the coastline in Queensland, we actually see the coastline moves from northwest to southeast. So even with a south-southeast movement, the system is likely getting a little bit closer to the Queensland coast the whole time. Now, if we continue tracking this a little bit into the longer term, there is starting to be better and better guidance that it will remain offshore in the longer term, but it will seek to increase winds and possibly swells on the southeast Queensland coast. So if you're a surfer, you'll probably enjoy that. 20 to 25 knot winds and a fairly deep fetch, so we should get some fairly good swells out of that as we head into Sunday. We see the system sort of just meanders about here in the southern Coral Sea. It begins what we call extratropical transition around about the Sunday period, or Saturday, between Saturday and Sunday. That's when it is no longer tropical, it becomes extratropical, and that's with the assistance of an upper level trough into the west of it. The upper level trough actually captures it and induces an extratropical transition or a baroclinic transition of the system. So basically that's a whole bunch of words to say that it won't be a tropical cyclone after the weekend because of the interaction in the upper levels between it and the upper level trough. And if we just fast forward then to Monday, you can see it continues to track in a southerly direction. Look, overall, there's a fairly high confidence in that track forecast, but once again, the issue that we always have in the Coral Sea is just that things can change very quickly. If I take you through a couple of the different models, just to show you that the Euro is not the only one we're using. So if we take a quick look at the Access G model from the Bureau of Meteorology, thanks to Weather Zone for the weather graphics, we can see that on Thursday, here's our tropical low in the northern Coral Sea. On Friday, it pushes just a little bit closer to the coast, as we're seeing, and the Euro's telling us it's going to do. Then on Saturday, it gets captured by an upper level trough and starts to push in a south-southeast direction. Sunday, it continues to push in that south to south-southeast direction, and by Monday, it is completing an extratropical, or at least beginning an extratropical transition into a non-tropical cyclone. Unfortunately for Queenslanders that are after rain, though, what a system out here in the central Coral Sea tends to do is drive some drier air across the state, and so we're going to see a big decrease in rainfall. So if you've been enjoying the rain anywhere Cairns southwards, sorry to say, the party's about to be over once this thing gets into the central Coral Sea and continues to push southwards. So enjoy the rain over the next couple of days, because after that there's going to be a distinct lack of it for at least 4 or 5 days after that. Then hopefully the system doesn't sit here for ages. It can just bugger off out here into the South Pacific, and we can start to get some more moist winds coming back into Queensland, and hopefully with the monsoon trough around, we'll see some heavier rain as we get into the latter parts of January. Unless you're a surfer, the worst case scenario is for the tropical low or the extratropical low, whatever it is at that point in time, to just sit here off the coast for a number of days, because it's just going to bring in dry, hot weather all over the state. So we don't want that to happen at this time of year, especially with a nice strong monsoon. We want to take advantage of that, so we want this thing to get out of the way so it allows that monsoon to do its thing. We take a look at the UK Met model, very similar to what we've been seeing, except they don't have that southwesterly movement towards Queensland. They basically have it pushing due south and remaining just in the Queensland area of responsibility, or the Australian area of responsibility here, west of 160. So expected to, in the UK Met model, develop into a TC. How strong though? Not overly strong. And once again, remembering that we do expect it to transition by early next week or late this weekend in the southern Coral Sea into an extratropical system. Very similar scenario from the experimental FIM8 model as well. The FIM8 model has a very similar track just west of 160 and pushing in a southerly direction. Once again, really a worst case scenario for those of you in Queensland that want rain, because this is a really negative thing if you wanted rain. We really need the system a lot closer to be able to enjoy at least the benefits of some onshore showers to the south of it. Taking a quick look at the longer term, early next week we expect another tropical low to form in the Gulf of Carpentaria. So, as I say, the monsoon is really active and we don't want this Queensland system to sit off the coast for forever and really take away any potential of this monsoon, giving Queensland some decent rain. So at this stage we're expecting a Gulf of Carpentaria low to develop early next week, maybe even as early as Sunday, but more than likely Monday or Tuesday, either in the central or the western Gulf of Carpentaria. Initial movement is very unclear at the moment. With the Gulf, it's really hard to predict movement too far out because there's never really strong influences in the steering up here. It's just a little bit too far north for a lot of the ridging. It's a little bit too far north for a lot of the ridging and also a lot of the troughing. So at this point in time, suffice to say, we are expecting a new tropical low to form in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And we see pretty clear guidance on that from both the European and the GFS, with the GFS also expecting a tropical low in the Gulf here. So really, folks, that's the next area we're watching. Don't pay too much attention to this one in the GFS. It's probably just spinning up a random circulation again. But this one here is the one we do need to pay attention to. That one is expected to form on many of the global models early next week. Alright folks, we won't go through rainfall tonight because it's pretty similar to yesterday's. So tomorrow night we'll go through rainfall and we'll also look at the MJO and we'll look at the longer term prospects of rainfall and cyclones for Northern Australia. Thanks for watching tonight. Talk to you tomorrow.